the ISCEA Student Chapter Egypt seminar on the key aspect of supply chain sustainability. I am Omar Hagras, the president of the Student Chapter Egypt, and your host for today's seminar. With our expert for today, Ms. Zofia, who will let us understand this topic in more details. Hello, Ms. Zofia, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Omar. Very nice to meet everyone. And thank you for the
Thank you.
opportunity to share all of these with all of you. And I hope you're going to have a few questions at the end of the seminar. And let's dig in. I think what's important to mention as well before we jump into the presentation or the seminar itself is that ISCEA actually has a course, a much more detailed course on sustainable supply chains. So at the end of the seminar, I'm gonna just share a little bit of detail about that, just one slide. And when you get the slides after the event, you can just look it up yourself. So let's just start. If everybody can see the slides, I'm gonna just jump
Yes.
in. So the key aspects of supply chain sustainability or sustainable supply chains, that's what we're gonna discuss today. And the reason why I chose the topic is partially because we hear so many negative things about sustainability and supply chains, namely, reporting and regulatory requirements, which is usually very heavy. A lot of work involved. Everybody is afraid of it. That's not exactly what we would like to see, right? Then the second one is really the actual work, the cost of it, and how to do it right in real life. So, and the answers sometimes don't leave us feeling better, but leave us feeling much more worried, right? Or thinking, okay, how am I going to make this work? And the last one really is when companies look at sustainability in their supply chains is the greenwashing. If we didn't get the whole thing right, or we didn't do the right thing, what kind of repercussions are we going to get for the company, right? So we try to be very, very cautious. So all of these things look like something that's either avoidable or very hard to attain. But I can tell you right now, and that's why I'm also engaged in this topic for a long time by now, it's really doable. We go through the key details of what you need to pay attention to, and of course, just look up, the rest of the details. This is really just an introductory session here. So let's jump into the details as much as possible. How we structure the content for today's session. I'm going to talk about a little bit about, what really a sustainable business or supply chain is defined. So what is it really? How do we define this, right? And then, of course, the difference between what we understand under sustainability and circularity or circular supply chains. And if we get a little bit of time, then I also take a look at, what the regenerative part of this whole concept looks like, and take a look at that. Then in the second part, I'm going to address, the impact assessment and its importance in the process, how it's related to becoming sustainable. Then after that, we look at the key external areas, which can have a really big impact on what we can or cannot do in our supply chain. I think it's not going to come as a surprise to any of you, because we all know that supply chains are interconnected with every part of the business as well as outside of the company. So that's going to be less of a surprise, but how these can help you, how these can work with you to become sustainable as a supply chain, that's important. And then sustainability action areas where the other functions are leading in the business, just like marketing or the others, and they can help us really in the process, or they can hinder us if we are not aligned, right? So it's also important to discuss. And finally, to piece the whole, together, how can we redefine our supply chain strategy with sustainability in the center, right? Including key actions, areas, and targets. So that's basically putting all of it together. And again, we could go into much more detail, but let's start. So what is really a sustainable business and a supply chain? And I think it doesn't come as a surprise that not many companies can really claim that they run a sustainable business and supply chain. And that is simply due to the fact that it was not a requirement. It was not exactly thought of for a long time. despite all the research and climate awareness in the scientific communities. So changing this from this very linear transactional mindset, I think you have heard the terms that I'm going to use now. This is the take, make, use, and dispose. This is really the transactional mindset that where companies are, or at least some of them still. So that needs to change, right? And renewing the materials and using resources sustainably in how we work and allow nature to regenerate these resources is not an easy task. And if a company didn't do it before, then it's really not, an easy undertaking for them. So all in all, we are here today to make it easier a little bit. So thank you for joining me on this journey today. So again, what is really, how do we define what is sustainable, right? And if you look at the right-hand side of this slide, you can see that there are three critical components, right? I'm sure this is something that you have heard before, but I think the context, how people or social, or planetary, environmental, or ecological, and the profitable or economical side of the story belongs together, right? So if you look at this chart or just little drawing here, you can see that as long as a company and its processes are bearable for the environment as well as for the social context where the company resides, and it's equitable for the people who work there and viable from an economic point of view, meaning also that the resources that they are using are not damaging the environment, then if all of these criteria are met, then we can call the company or the supply chain or business sustainable. What I like to bring here every time is that the vocabulary definition of what is sustainable, you can look it up yourself in Merriam-Webster, and it's really capturing the essence. It says a method of using a resource so that the resource is not depleted or permanently damaged. And I think no matter what kind of literature anyone is reading on sustainability or anything related to this topic, if you just keep this in mind, that will help you navigate, the vast information source that you are getting from the different sources. So again, if a company is aware of what they are doing, they have done an impact assessment, and that's why we're going to talk about that impact assessment, and then they are aware of their impact, they have no negative impact on the people, planet, or profit side, which is again not easy to reach, then they are sustainable. And these efforts need to be equally distributed between the inside out and outside in aspects and how the company is working. I'm going to detail this inside out and outside in aspect a little bit more later. So I think now we get this concept of how we define sustainability in our supply chains and for our supply chains. So let's take a little bit of a deeper look into what does it really look like in reality? How do we do this definition when we really need to tangibly address this, right? I'm not going to go through everything on this slide. It's really dense, but it will be there for you after the session. So if we look at just the people side, and I deliberately dissected them into the three areas, and we didn't directly and don't directly talk about how these interact, but that I leave to you to actually ask questions about if you would like to at the end. So if we look at the people or social side, that's also number one, because that's the most important part, right? There, the examples that I can bring is really saying, okay, so the company really has to pay a minimum living wage, and it's not the minimum defined, wage in some of the countries, which is very far from what a living wage is, but a living wage to all of the supply chain employees that they have in the company and with all of their suppliers in their network. Or when moving locations, if a company decides to move a location, then they need to ensure that the employees get support in finding new work, right? Outplacement, for instance. So we can walk through all of these aspects, right? So, and the incentives are the the aspect where we all link this together, right? So if you look at all the three aspects, and I gave away a bit of the answer for later, these are all linked together by incentives, right? So the leadership remuneration, as well as how we remunerate our whole company, need to be linked together to these targets. And then if these targets are met, then they get remunerated and incentivized. So then the people really do what they need to do. It will not always have the mindset change, but it's a good step forward to establish these in the company. And if someone is really going in the other direction, then it's a good sign that the misalignment is so great that the company either needs to get rid of that person, or they need to help the person to change the mindset because the company has decided to become sustainable. So after this, I'm going to take a look at what I mentioned already, this balancing of these efforts, and why it is so important for sustainability. So I don't know how many of you are fully aware of this, but businesses have been looking at impact and risk analysis from their point of view for a long time. And this also includes many of the ESG frameworks earlier, which were voluntary, right? And there they did a little bit of outside in looking, but mainly how the external environment will impact the company, right? They didn't look at how they impact the environment or they impact the social environment that they are operating in. So that's why it's very important that we all understand that we need to look at both directions, right? This bi-directional relationship of impact and risk. So not just the company being risked or impacted by something from the outside, but how the company impacts the outside as well. And the balance between means, that either the company is going bankrupt if it's imbalanced, or it remains unsustainable again if it's imbalanced. So that balance is very, very important. And of course, from a supply chain point of view, I wanted to bring the other aspect in which we always discuss. We always need to balance cost, quality, and service, right? Every single person who works in supply chain or worked for a couple of years at least, they will hear this from their superiors, from their leaders. And with that said, I would say for supply chains, and that's why I love the topic and love to talk about sustainability in supply chains, because for us, balancing different conflicting aspects is not a big deal. We got used to this, right? So actually taking a look at your supply chain and starting some of the sustainability efforts right in your supply chain is the right thing to do. So I believe supply chain people are well situated to do a really good job. And of course, the impact of supply chains is really great globally across every single entity. On this slide, I brought a couple of do's and don'ts when we talk about sustainable goal setting, or how we become sustainable, right? And I think that goes also back to the third point I brought right at the start, which is greenwashing and what we should and shouldn't do really. And there, I think the most important part is that we need to define specific targets and refine these based on the impact assessments that we have carried out and those findings that we found out about our own impact as a company, as an assault and as a supply chain, and iterate from there, right? So really from small change to a bigger change, and ensure the control of these processes. This is nothing new for supply chain again. So this internal, external control, we are all very aware of, but in relation to sustainability, it's even more important because of what we are balancing here. And of course, collaboration is also a big do in this case, because majority of the barriers or the issues and those hardships that people bring up related to sustainability very much belong to not understanding each other in a supply network, right? So when we talk about suppliers, customers, so all the partners we have in our supply chain network, we can have a much better conversation and a much better understanding of what we are doing together and how we can help each other. So the collaboration is key. And of course, there are a few don'ts, which I think most of you will recognize from the last couple of years, where some of the companies unfortunately started out by setting large-scale targets, right, with absolutely impossible deadlines, like really will go carbon neutral by 2025, and then nothing has been done really in the company. That's never gonna fly, right? So the work needs to be done, and then it's credible work. And of course, the other thing is forgetting to refine targets. That's also not credible, because based on the impact assessment, the targets will change. We, uncover issues, we uncover opportunities along the way, and that will just make us change those targets. So it's easier said than done, but at the same time, I think if a company starts from saying, these are our initial draft targets in our supply chains, and we honestly will iterate these targets based on what we find in the next couple of months or year, then it's credible towards the external communities as well as investors. And of course, the other thing which I unfortunately witnessed in the last couple of years is where companies really went, I call it brute force. We can call it just, in medias res, just going directly to suppliers, to partners, and forcing them to comply with some of the new upcoming legislation without helping them whatsoever, right? That's not going to help anyone. So those are really the biggest don'ts in this case. All right. This is really the area where I think this first part of the topic can come together. And I think many of you encountered, debate or just misalignment even in the scientific community about what really is the difference between sustainability, between circularity and regeneration. Now, I brought here two of those definitions, which are so far agreed in the academic and scientific community. And the key difference between being sustainable and being circular has been defined by the first one, sustainability, as not having a negative impact on people and the environment, and of course on our economic aspects. And as the moment you are circular as a company, then you have no impact. Basically, it's not just not having a negative impact, but reversing the negative impact by regeneration, by recirculation, and by upcycling, etc., of those materials, or changing the business concept or the business model completely from a take, make, break kind of attitude to, for instance, a shared ownership type of setup, right? Which is very different and uses much less resources in the first place. So these are the key differences, and lately I just wanted to share that as well. It's really important when we talk about regeneration and this misalignment between these different concepts. I believe the point really is that no one can become sustainable if you are not recirculating and not regenerating what materials we are using as we stand, right? So we learned a lot from the scientific and the academic community, and I safely say that really, if we really want to do a good job and become sustainable, truly sustainable, you can go back to the original definition that I mentioned in the first couple of slides, then we need to be more mindful, more cautious about the materials we are using and how we are using the human power, the human intelligence, creativity, everything, because we are not just wasting, pure materials like whatever material went into my phone or anything else, right? But also we are wasting valuable, talented human inputs as well from our supply chains in many cases, or in businesses. So that's very important, I think. All right. So based on all the concepts, right, that we put together, I think it's important to mention the impact assessment and how it can help us to become sustainable in a little bit more detail and why it's important, right? So I think I mentioned already that the impact assessment itself is not going to make anyone sustainable, but it's a key element in allowing the company to understand their impact on the environment and the social environment they are operating in. And from there, they can define their targets, where they can take action, or where they need to redefine what the company is doing. So clear and credible goal setting to become sustainable as a company and as a supply chain can only be done if you had done an impact assessment along your value chains or supply chains, right? So let's take a look at these. So what is really an impact assessment? An impact assessment is basically a set of different tools and methods like life cycle assessment. I'm just mentioning one, or bigger frameworks along the UN SDGs, for instance. I would not mention ESG tools or GRI, but they can also help, right? But let's focus on what we are trying to achieve by this impact assessment, regardless of what tool you are using. And that's where we really need to focus on how we approach it, right? So it's very important that you're not focusing on the tools, but what you want to do and what you need to achieve there, right? So to assess your impact as a supply chain, both from a social and ecological point of view, we need to quantify the impact, not just identify the impact, but quantify these to a sufficient degree to be able to take action on, right? As an example here, if you are using local water resources, but you are not aware of how much you can take from that water resource, and I'm giving you a very easy example, right? So there are much more complex examples, but just for the sake of understanding here. So if you use a water resource, but you are not aware of how much you can take from that water resource, and it depletes the resource itself, which is being relied on by other communities apart from you as a business, then that's a very clear negative impact that the company is having on not just the environment, but also the social environment around them, right? So the point is that whatever resource we are using, we need to make sure that we are aware of how much we are using it, what the impact of that use is on the environment and our social environment, and then define how we're gonna decrease that impact, right? And of course, these tools that I just mentioned right at the gate, they can help us get there. So what is really, the critical part where I need to say that the impact assessment can become one of the most crucial part of becoming sustainable. And the reason why I mention this is because there are companies that I could mention, really large ones, who have taken, I think, more than 10 years to even complete, some of the impact assessment on one or two of their total value chains. That's how complex and big they are. So as you can see, what are those factors where we need to take a look at how we're going to break it down, and we need to be careful there as supply chain professionals. So it depends really on how mature and complex our supply chain is. The more complex, obviously, the more work you will need to do. How many resources we can make available for the work involved. If you have very limited people in your teams, then it's going to be hard. And how much support you can get from the business owners and the top leadership, because that buy-in needs to be there, just like for everything else that we usually mention in a supply chain context. If it's not there, it's not going to happen. So really, we need to take it seriously, because if it's not done correctly, if it's not done fully, then it can do as much damage as intended help. So I would say that's probably one of the most important aspects. And if a company is not ready to do it, then asking for help from those who have done it peers, other companies, or even external companies as such. But peers is probably the best, where they have direct experience, or really just like we talk about it here today. uh, Even if you are with a company, you can ask for external help, just hitting people up on LinkedIn who do this job, right? And you can get valuable answers. So again, the more complex your supply chain is, the heavier and more time consuming this impact assessment will be, but you need to do it. And then of course, from there, people can immediately see how important it is to reduce the complexity in their supply chains and make them more simple. So we had the luxury to overcomplicate some of our supply chains, at least in some of the industries. And I think it's now time to get them a little bit leaner and simpler. And I think many of you can smile here, because lean management is very much in our wheelhouse um, as supply chain professionals. So what are the key principles of conducting such an assessment, right? So every point of the value chain, with this inside out and outside in focus, we need to ask the questions that I mentioned just previously at the previous slide. So to put together this real life puzzle of where our impact is, how we are impacting um, the environment, that those are the questions that we need to answer, right? So again, what is this inside out? This is really our impact and not the other way around. So again, back to the water resource, right, as I mentioned. So how do we do these assessment points, right? What is important there? So the area of impact, to define the area of impact, what the company's obligations are towards the impacted in that area, right? Defining the magnitude of the impact, and then prioritization of how we're going to reduce that impact and the mitigation options. Of course, the last 2 points are almost standard part of project management within supply chain, but it's equally important here as well, right? And making sure that the mitigation options for issues that we find are also sustainable solutions, right? So that's also very, very important. Here, just a not so fun, but unfortunately a fact that throughout my professional life, I've seen assessment reports where um, the company established these inside out versus outside in impact and risk assessment incorrectly, and unfortunately that's what they listed in their GRI report, which was of course false, but it happened. So that's why it's important to pay attention to these principles. Very quickly about some of the methods that can help you carry out such an assessment. And here I always make the disclaimers that I'm not supporting any of these as a professional, particularly, and I'm not involved in any of these companies or organizations. So in that sense, what I'm sharing here today and what I recommend is for you to take a look at these and evaluate yourself whether these are relevant or not for your company, and whether these can help you in the process or not. And I give a few examples in terms of what type of companies are using these tools, where they got help from these tools, right? So I would say the multi-capital scorecard is really a very complex and then complicated set of scorecard. I would say it's not overly complicated, but I would only use it if it's a very complex company like Novartis, as I mentioned in the example, because it's really heavy to manage. It's really hard to work through, requires a lot of resources. And Novartis actually, as a company, they dedicated a whole department to carry out this assessment, and they hired a lot of people for it. So that's how big the whole thing is. The other one is Circulytics from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. That's much easier, but still not easy as a tool. It's for a mix of businesses. It doesn't matter really the size or what they are doing, but but they are mostly, endorsed by NGOs who are focused on sustainability and used by mostly retail or FMCG, CPG companies. The last one, the B impact assessment or B lab assessment, is something which many people contest if it's really the right tool, if it's really helping as much as it should or could. Based on having seen quite a few of them, I would say it is a really helpful, useful tool. What is a drawback with the tool is that you really need to do a lot of analysis on your own. The tool will not help you make it, and it will not help or guide you through how to do that analytics itself. You need to ask for extra help to complete that assessment. But of course, they are also endorsed by smaller companies. Actually, now it's bigger companies as well, but mainly smaller companies at this point in time. So again, what we should note and cannot forget is really that these people, processes, systems, enablers that we are using every time, we need to just put them in the context of the 3P, people, planet, and profit, right? And not just take the profit side into consideration. What I would like to add here, which many people sometimes forget, also professionals, is that when we are talking about sustainable business cases for any company or supply chain, when we are comparing these with earlier business cases, then it's very important. And it's not just the impact assessment or the tools where we are working through these, but in general, in daily business life, when we look at business cases, it's very important to compare apples to apples. So when I hear a lot of companies and a lot of professionals complaining about how expensive sustainable solutions are, then I usually see many people forgetting about the fact that they should have adjusted the original business case that was not sustainable compared to the sustainable business case. So if I look at just, or giving you just one example, which might be again a simple example, I just try to illustrate the situation. If we want to opt for a sustainable solution, which is complete with, for instance, the extended manufacturing or producer responsibility, right? And you look at the cost of the product for the entirety of the life cycle, and the original business cases that you want to compare it to, they don't include, impact that was externalized by the company to somewhere. Maybe it was done, maybe it was not done, but they didn't take a look at the full life cycle of the product. Then of course these are not comparable. I know it sounds ridiculous if we look at it like this when we discuss in a classroom setting, but unfortunately I've seen it in companies. They just forgot to add those elements, and then they looked at it like it's never gonna make it, and then we had to correct the business cases, right? So I know it sounds a little bit obvious or even ridiculous for many, but when you look at these business cases, look for some of the aspects that they might have forgotten to include. All right, back to the methodologies, right? And I mentioned some of these do's and don'ts already, so we're just gonna run through quickly. I would rather leave this to you for the future, as a quick reminder, what we should do and shouldn't do when we do the assessment. So again, I think many people smile here, because the first point for me is to have all your value chain maps and processes ready and up to date. It's not as a given as we think it is. Many companies don't keep them up to date, etc. So just make sure that these are up to date. And of course, work through this first holistic view and go deeper from there. Don't start slicing up immediately, or even if it seems very complex, but have this overview and then go into the rest of the T, right? So the end of the analysis. And of course, before we do the assessment, make sure that everybody who's involved, they understand how the method works. Believe it or not, I've seen that as well. And we needed to go back and re-educate the people about the method, because they got a few aspects wrong just because of not understanding what they had to do there. So that's very important, and more common than not, that people just don't bring everybody up to speed there. So pay attention there. When you do these methods and there is something that doesn't add up, or you question some of the outcome, just question it. Never take anything, at face value. None of these methods are foolproof as we speak. So they are really good, they are helpful, but none of them are foolproof. So just if you see something doesn't add up, or doesn't make sense as an outcome, question it, and don't let anyone tell you that, oh, this is the method, so you need to just trust the method. Of course, you need to trust the method, but also do trust your logic, your common sense, and your professional expertise. We all have good professional expertise. We need to trust it as well, right? And last but not least, be honest. So if many of the outcomes that we see in these analysis activities, they are not nice, they are ugly, right? We were not doing the right thing, and that's okay, because we were not sustainable for a long time. The point is to make these much better, right? So just be honest and work from there. And of course, we come to the don'ts, right? There, I think it's not that many, but don't rush the assessment, right? It's almost like with any project, don't rush the planning, don't rush the assessment. And it's also important that as soon as you reach kind of a clear outcome in areas, no need to overdo it. There is no need for analysis paralysis, just start acting on it. It's also important because I have seen, again, if someone is doing an analysis for 10 plus years and they still haven't taken action, that's not a good sign, right? Then the company will never become sustainable. The other 2 points which are important is that, of course, we have regulatory legal requirements, but if there are none, and that's probably the more important part, right? As most of the sustainability related regulatory requirements and legal requirements are evolving as we speak. Even if there is none in the area that you work in, trust the assessment and start working from there, and the requirements will come sooner or later, but you don't need to wait for an external push or an external requirement to start doing the work. And of course, the last one is, again, never forget that it's time consuming and effort intensive, so that always needs to be factored in. And with this, we came to a point where we can look at the external areas, right, that we need to rope into, or we don't need to rope into, but ideally we can, and they can help us or they can hinder us, right, in the process to become sustainable. For example, if you have a complex supply chain, you have offshored, outsourced activities with other companies, of course, now we, or the majority of us now knows that we need to include these aspects in our evaluation. For a long time, companies did not include it, right? So, and they had very, very nice results. And then the moment they started including these areas, which many refer to also as scope 3 in greenhouse gas emission protocol language, then they realize that, oops, we have a problem. We haven't taken everything into consideration. So let's take a look at some of these, because if we don't include them, if we don't make sure that we are okay there, then it can become a limiting factor, or even a key barrier that we cannot overcome when we need to. So what are these externalities, right, that I just mentioned? Yeah, the current business environment can be one of them, where, and I think that's one of those things which we also hear quite a lot from companies, this competitive environment, which is not a collaborative environment. is also fostering fear in many ways. Primary fear is what if I'm the first mover? I shift my cost base, I shift how I work, and the others are not moving, and I'm gonna lose out, right? It's a valid fear, and there, of course, accepting these uncomfortable meetings is just one aspect. But the other aspect, which is the second pillar here, is the legislation in place. I would say as a company, one can always, and also as a supply chain professional within that company, just to point that out, we can do a lot to influence legislation, right? Especially if you work for a larger company with a larger footprint, then you have an opportunity to inform and influence these legislations, not necessarily to not become sustainable, but on the contrary, to help the legislators to bring these requirements on. Therefore, you can safely move on with your transition and nobody will be left behind. The competition will also move in the same direction, right? Again, the other aspect which we can mention is business partners attitude. You know, if your suppliers, customers, they just don't understand what you're doing, or collaboration was not a practice before, it was exploitational or downright hostile as a partner relationship within the supply network, then it can take quite a long time to change that, you know, change attitudes. Sometimes it takes, you know, a change of people, even at your partner, to allow a change to happen and to move to a sustainable setup. And of course, the last one, which is probably the biggest barrier in many of the companies still, is the owner's expectations, right, or shareholders. And and so far, you know, profitability is ranking quite high before people and planet in many of those people's books, which is now changing. But at the same time, it's just important to acknowledge that these elements can become a barrier at any point in time. And if they are not well informed, if they are not brought on the journey well in advance, actually before anyone else in the company, then that can tank your efforts, right? So they can really make it sink and not get anywhere. So I hope that you know, understanding these aspects can help you also place your not just expectations, but also how you educate people around you in the company, how you manage stakeholders in the company to help you on your journey. And to this part of the topic, it also belongs the internal areas of the business where our cross functions, other business functions that we work with, they can help us or they can hinder us in the process, right? And let me bring these three examples, let's put it this way, because these are really areas where you can have a large impact on what you're doing in your supply chain, what you can and cannot do. Let's face it. So going back to, you know, the early part of or the start of our value chains, product, service, design, and R&D, internally or externally. I listed here internal, but it can be both internal, external. Can have a very big impact on what you can and cannot do. Supply chain is essentially executing on those wishes that they dream up, right? So if they dream up something that's completely unsustainable, then it's hard to win from there, right? So getting them involved as early as possible and redesigning your value chain from the get-go, that's the best bet you can have to succeed in turning your supply chain sustainable. Of course, finance, legal, and quality, internal and external, they can really help you a lot with information, data sources, or even just structuring the data. Finance and legal, they are really, all of them, even quality teams are super used to structuring data well as well. Not that supply chain teams cannot do that, but I think if you get extra help there, extra hands on deck, that's never a bad idea because it's quite a lot of work. So don't ever reject if you get help offered from any of these teams for your sustainability endeavors. And of course, the last that I mentioned is marketing, PR, and commercial, where the point is that, again, going back to collaboration, the more your partners and those that also set the agenda and communication about your sustainability journey understand what they should and shouldn't communicate, what they can and shouldn't say, to avoid greenwashing as well. That's very important, right? And also that they understand what you're doing. So bringing them on board as fast as possible is critical for success and to avoid greenwashing. And with that said, we went through, the critical aspects, defining what sustainability really is, getting, that impact analysis underway, really looking at your stakeholders internally, externally, along your entire value chain, your supply network, partners, suppliers, customers. After that, when you really took the deep look at everything, and again, the full analysis doesn't need to be done, but at least the basic concept needs to be already done. Then you can redefine, your supply chain strategy with the sustainable targets and sustainability in mind and in the center, right? So that takes quite a lot to get there, and that's why I'm not a fan of publishing, wishes and new strategies fast. I think it's just prudent to do the right thing and look at your value chain before you actually redefine these and rush into conclusions that you shouldn't make. So how shall we do it? And that's just really a high level overview, right? So ladies and gentlemen, if you need more information after the session, please reach out. Happy to discuss this in more details. This is really just a short, introductory session. But let's take a quick look at what we are dealing with here as redefining your supply chain strategy with sustainability in mind. Of course, how do we define supply chain strategy in the first place? We derive it from the overall business strategy based on how our value chains, operating models, organization models were defined, right? So what is critical is that when it comes to sustainability, it needs to be embedded and not developed as a separate strategy. So that's why I'm always saying redefining your supply chain strategy and not just saying I have a sustainability strategy and then a supply chain strategy. So these need to be married up. Otherwise, it will never work. It can be supported, but it needs to be one. So again, just to lighten the work, it doesn't need to be a fully new strategy. You can update your existing supply chain strategy, bearing in mind your impact analysis and examining your impact on the environment and on the social environment. So if we look at the inputs, what we are usually doing, that's really the standard, taking top-down targets into consideration, impact assessment, external factors, cross-functional insights, and existing supply chain strategies. These are the things we mentioned, right, in the last roughly 50 minutes. And then, of course, based on these inputs, if you have all of these in hand, you can do the reevaluation. So are we using really, so these are the questions that I'm usually using when we do this exercise. Are we really using the right supply network models, right? Is it really the one, or is there anything else that we could consider, right? So don't be afraid of questioning, fundamentals that have been in the business for long, because might be that's one of the key barriers you are facing, and not the nitty-gritty details in terms of which supplier you are selecting in the process. As we need to wrap up, I'm going to quickly just share the rest, and then we can go to questions. So based on that, looking at the capabilities and whether these are correctly segmented, these are just the standard strategic work. And of course, what is also very critical is redefining the supply chain metrics and incentives, right? I mentioned that earlier in the session. And of course, what kind of business rules do we need to change that allows our processes to be changed as well to become sustainable? Sometimes business rules are the ones that keep us from becoming sustainable. Very quick example. I have a company that I worked with, where a very large company, there was the reason why they could not go more sustainable on some of their logistics lanes that they were operating globally. And guess why? Not because they couldn't change them in theory, because the tax department didn't allow them to change it, right? For a multitude of reasons, but it's first challenging, right? Um, and of course, if we look at the systems that we have in place for our supply chains, are these supporting? Do we have enough firepower for analytics? Not just manpower that we need to use, but really the analytics from IT systems and ERP and everything we have on hand. And last but not least, and this is probably one of the critical ones that I mentioned already, um, how do we improve our collaboration and relationship with our partners in the business? So there, I would say, if all of these are brought together, all of these have been reevaluated, then you should have a reevaluated, confirmed sustainability target set and aligned supply chain strategy with it. So again, it's not different from a general strategy review, but what goes into that evaluation, and what kind of input you need to use, that's going to be different, right? And last but not least, the end of your priorities. And with that said, we can wrap it up. This is really the page that you can visit after the session, where you can take a look at the deeper certified supply chain professional in sustainability or sustainable supply chain professional program from ISCEA. And then, of course, last but not least, kind reminder, sustainability is not a project, but a new way of doing business and supply chain management. I hope that this you can also keep in mind. So if you look at the start of the session and the end of the session, if you keep these two in mind, you cannot go really wrong. So I really hope you enjoyed the session. It was valuable, helpful, and it was informative for you. And now we can really open for questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Sofia, for this presentation. Really is very important topic, sustainable supply chain. So we can start with question, and can I start with my question?
Please.
There is a role in for technology in sustainable supply chain.
Yes.
So in which way this role can be?
It's a really good point, Omar. And frankly speaking, many people underestimate technology as a part of sustainability, right? There, as I mentioned, really in the last couple of slides in the session, what is important to know is that do you have the right tools and systems and technology in place to allow you to execute the impact analysis, as well as to drive the business analytics related to that, right? To set new targets and set new incentives in the business. And if you don't have that overview, if the technology that you have in place, especially in supply chain, it's not supporting, that cradle to cradle, or if I may say that way, as we earlier said many times, end to end supply network view, and you really cannot connect the dots, which is hard, right? If you look at the very complex supply chain, it's almost impossible to do without good technology in place. So there, I would say it's so critical that if you don't have it, you can almost forget it, because you cannot use enough people to conduct the analytics and come to the right conclusion. So really good question and spot on.
Thank you, Ms. Sofia. So anyone have any question now? Please raise your hand if you have a question. Mariam, Ahmad, Basmala. Anyone have a question? Ahmad, go ahead.
Hello, Miss Zofia. What are
Hello.
the concerns of supply chain sustainability?
Sorry, can you repeat your question? I could not hear the start, which was probably the most important. What are the
What are the concerns of supply chain sustainability?
the concerns? Okay, so
Concern, yeah.
Yeah, good. That's the only word that I didn't understand. So the concerns of sustainable supply chains are literally the fact that there are no valuable and valid solution providers. And it's not just technology, but we are behind on solutions what we can employ, right? We are getting there. As an example, logistics, right? We are still using trucks, right? And we don't really have alternatives in many ways, right? So there, people really need to think well beyond the conventional ways. And it's not necessarily taking, for instance, trucks out or ships out or planes out, but how we can redefine the supply chain and the supply network to enable us to use less of these resources, right, without changing that. Um, so I would say that's one of the key concerns, which most of the professionals whom I work with, we are very concerned with, that we don't have fast enough input of new solutions, materials as well, etc., which really fulfill the criteria that we are looking for in sustainable supply chains. And of course, the other thing, which I mentioned already during the presentation, is the lack of real buy-in from the leadership or the management of companies, and they still prioritize profit over balancing the three aspects. And yeah, and of course, the other thing and the last one, which I would mention, is that we still don't have enough people educated in the ways of sustainability. So on a daily basis, I meet a lot of people who have never really heard of even the basic concepts that I shared here with you today. So that for me is really concerning. These are the three that we usually meet.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Also, Ahmed is one of the coordinators in Student Chapter Egypt.
Very
And
nice to hear.
Mariam have a question. Already, Mariam is the vice president of the Student Chapter. Go ahead, Mariam.
Hello. My question was how can supply chain transparency be enhanced to promote sustainability?
Thank you for the question, Mariam. It really almost ties in with what Omar asked from me. The transparency and the ability to monitor what you're doing in your supply chains is critical. Otherwise, you cannot really get there. So absolutely critical. I don't even want to, saying it anymore. It's really critical. So transparency is key, and technology can help there all the way.
As you said, Ms. Zofia, that the sustainability supply chain is not a project, it's a work and a life. Today we have Industry 5, so Industry 5 changed in sustainable supply chain. So
Correct.
every day there is an improvement in sustainable supply chain.
Absolutely. You're so right.
Yeah. So anyone have any question now? So I think that will be all for today. Thank you, Ms. Sofia, and thank you for everyone to attend this seminar. And hope to meet you, Ms. Sofia, again, and meet you and make with you anything in your work again. Thank you for everyone.
Absolutely. The pleasure was mine. Very nice to meet you, everyone. And we'll share the slides from the session with you.
Thank
Thank
you
you.
very much. Thank you.
Bye now.